February last year, when he declared himself basically emperor for life and emperor of everything. He had organized in the previous few months for his party colleagues to rewrite the Chinese constitution so that term limits would be done away with, and he would be able legally to stay as leader of China for as long as he wanted. This was a very startling development.
It's my pleasure to chair this meeting and to introduce Jane Perlez, who has just completed a 5-year assignment in Beijing for the New York Times. She's had a distinguished reporting career, preceded by a long stint in Pakistan, and she's here as a Shorenstein Fellow this semester to consider what she has learned over the last 5 years about the leadership of China and where China is headed. So rather than drone on myself, let me give you Jane Perlez.
I've been a foreign correspondent all my life, so you may wonder how I ended up in China, so I'll tell you a little bit about that. I had been a diplomatic correspondent in Washington for the New York Times. I had been in Africa, I'd been in Central Europe, covered the Kosovo war from Kosovo, or before it started. And then after Washington, I went to Jakarta, where I saw, starting in 2002, while the United States was distracted by the war in Iraq, I saw the rise of China in Southeast Asia. And I saw how China was trading furiously with these countries, many of whom were American allies. And I saw how China was investing its leadership to come down to Southeast Asia. Then I went to Pakistan, which of course is a big ally of China's. And after I'd finished there, the New York Times called up and said, well, why don't you go to China? You're supposed to know something about American foreign policy. And you're in Jakarta, so why don't you go to China and cover China's foreign policy? What they didn't know was that I had been in China even before Richard Nixon in 1967 as an Australian university student. I was in my first year at university there, and the student union announced that they were organizing the first ever student travel program. You could go to Indonesia, which seemed too close, India, which sounded like too much dysentery for me, or China, which sounded really amazing. So 57 of us went off to China in 1967. We thought it was going to be a nice summer vacation, and we ended up in the middle of the Cultural Revolution. So we have a little snip of a movie that was taken while we were inside China. And I thought I would show this to show you what it was like then, because we'll be talking about what it's like now.
From the red east rises the sun. In China appears Mao Zedong. He works for the people's welfare. He is the people's great saviour. This is the battle hymn of the Red Guard. Its philosophy, the thought of Mao Zedong. Everywhere, Red Guards wanted us to sign their Mao.
That's me.
Not with our own names, but with the words, long great.
Trying to say, can't sign, can't sign.
In the Peking exhibition building, we were shown a display depicting the course of China's Cultural Revolution. This section presented some of the evidence given by the Red Guard for their expulsion of the 6 Belgian nuns in 1966. One letter to Rome contained a code. This old textbook showed Tibet as a separate country. At the suggestion of our hosts, we elected to complete our journey to a commune near Shanghai with a short march through the fields in true Red Guard style. We were accompanied by Red Guard university students from Shanghai, many of them English-speaking. Their university, like all other schools and universities in China, has been shut down since June. The entire curriculum advised to place more emphasis on politics. This means the study of the thought of Chairman Mao. We didn't meet any Red Guards who ever questioned the wisdom of this change.
This is the Great Hall of the People in Beijing.
In Peking, we were received by Marshal Chen Yi, Minister for Foreign Affairs and Vice Premier of China. When asked about the criticisms of him by the Red Guards, he said that it is good that the leaders of a country can be criticised, adding that he also could criticise the Red Guards if he wanted to.
So I included that last clip of Chen Yi, the foreign minister at the time, for a reason. He was very proud of the Cultural Revolution, he said, because there was all this mutual criticism. But in fact, 8 months later, he was taken down by Chairman Mao and put into basically isolation, and he was really disgraced in a very sad way. And I have to say, when I went back to China in the 90s on a small assignment for the Times, I hooked up with Chen Yi's son, Chen Xiaolu, and I got to know him during my last assignment there. And he was a really special person, I thought. He was not many people of that princeling class, meaning the sons of well-known Chinese in the political Politburo, would talk openly in restaurants with people like myself, but he did. And in 2015, he went public and said he really felt badly and apologized for the actions he took as a teenager during the Cultural Revolution. This was a very brave thing to do in the milieu of China today. And to my great sadness, Chen Xiaolu, the son, was put in sort of detention in late 2017 because he was one of the founders of Anbang, one of the big Chinese conglomerates, which the regime was going after. And a few months later, he was released, and he was in Hainan, the southern island, and he died. I think many of his friends, and I certainly agree, think he died because of the stress that he was put under during that period. But we want to now switch to today, and we have something from October 1, earlier this month, which is to show where China is today compared to 1967 when I was first there. And I think one way to look at this is that this is an illustration of Xi Jinping's dream. He, as you know, is the current leader of China, and as soon as he came to power, he made it clear that he was going to be in direct competition with the United States across the board, including the military. So this was an 80-minute parade on October the 1st. It, of course, came at the same time as the protests in Hong Kong, but the censorship is very strong in China, so as far as the Chinese people were concerned, this was what was on show on October 1st, and this is meant to send the message that, watch out, the United States, how long can you really dominate Asia militarily? They were showing here their new long-range ballistic missiles, among other things. So I want to concentrate today, in the early part of the talk, on Xi Jinping, the leader. As it turns out, his coming to power coincided with my going to China, so I was able to watch very closely as he took power. So this is at the State Department in February 2012, when he was vice president, and he was hosted by Vice President Biden and by Hillary Clinton at a very fancy lunch on the 7th floor of the State Department. Kissinger was there, Bob Zoellick was there, Yang Jiechi from the Chinese side, the former foreign minister, and a whole phalanx of very important Chinese were there. And the mood was very buoyant. I was there because I was the New York Times correspondent going out there, just sitting here, down here to the left of Xi. And it was Valentine's Day, I remember that. And the conversation was all positive. So after Washington, Xi did a very clever thing. He went to Iowa. He'd been there in 1985. There he is in the back as a young county official. One of the first batch of Chinese officials, I guess, one of the early batches of Chinese officials to come to the United States and have a look. And he stayed with this family. The wife, the mother remarked later, he stayed in a bedroom with Star Trek and American football motives. And he went around Iowa for 10 days looking at agribusiness and looking how it was done in the United States. And here he is in 2012 meeting the same people and saying what great friends he is with the people of Iowa. And then after Iowa, guess what? He went to LA to a Lakers game. And basketball, many of you probably know, was introduced into China by the missionaries in sort of the very late 19th century. And it was the one game that Mao Zedong said was okay, it wasn't an imperialist game, so it was played even during the tough times. So we know that the NBA has gotten into a spot of trouble in the last month or so by saying the wrong things, but Xi seems to be really enjoying this game. And I show these images because it was a very, I thought, interesting way to wrap himself, I won't say wrap himself in the American flag, but to show that he was going to be a leader, strong and exuding strength, but he was going to be someone that the United States could deal with. But it didn't really turn out that way. A few months later, he went back and he got the position, as we all expected, as General Secretary of the Communist Party. And here he is sort of handing Hu Jintao, his predecessor, who was a kind of bland, not very expressive steward of China for 10 years, is handing over to the guy who exudes some kind of charisma, if you want. It wasn't long before she really revealed, if you like, who he was. He came, this was in October 2012, and in December he gave a secret speech to a party enclave saying that he would never be like a Gorbachev. That Gorbachev had presided over the disintegration of the Soviet Union, and the reason why Gorbachev had failed was because he didn't keep the Communist Party in line, and that Xi was going to make sure that the Communist Party of China was strong and would be unified and would be stronger than it's ever been. The second thing that he did that I think struck a lot of us was he censored, or his minions censored very quickly, a group of well-known personalities known as the Big V. And these people had Weibo, sites on Weibo, which is the big internet platform, and they were expressing basically what they wanted to express. Saying some of them were slightly pro-democracy, nothing dramatic like China should be a democracy, but they were not hewing to the party line. And many of them had tens of millions of followers. They were taken down very quickly. Then in September 2013, what was most noticeable was the release of Document 9. This was a document that had the kind of 7 truths that China would not put up with. The first one was Western constitutionalism. And this was a paper that was taken very seriously inside the party. After that, or at about the same time, Xi Jinping traveled to Kazakhstan, one of the neighboring states in Central Asia. And just for the hell of it, I went along because it was one of his early trips overseas, and I was sort of interested to see what he had to say. The Chinese rarely announce things in advance. So I was very surprised to be in this lecture hall in Astana and to find him announcing the Belt and Road Initiative, or One Belt, One Road as it was then called, which was this giant plan for China to build infrastructure from China across Central Asia and into Europe to knit China to more closely with rails and roads and ports to its main trading partners. And this was pretty quickly seen as a direct challenge to American interests in that part of the world, and to some extent has proven to be so. And Belt and Road has, of course, developed beyond just that route, but to Africa and to a certain extent to Latin America. After Belt and Road, we noticed that there was more aggressive behavior by the Chinese Navy, if you want to say, in the South China Sea. I don't know whether this took the American PACOM by surprise or not, but it certainly took reporters and I think people in Washington by surprise. And quite quickly, China was building artificial islands in the South China Sea with huge, very, very good and very fast at construction. And before you knew it, there were completed islands with military-style runways and ports able to take the Chinese Navy. Around the same time, China announced the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, which was seen in some quarters as a Chinese version of the World Bank, which was a kind of misnomer. Washington was hysterical when this thing was announced. They said, we don't want any of our allies to join the Chinese bank, and did try to get Australia and South Korea, for example, not to join. But it's a kind of losing proposition to prevent countries from doing business with the world's largest trading nation. And of course, Washington lost and South Korea and Australia joined, followed by all the European countries. And AIIB, as it's known by shorthand, was actually, its articles were drafted by a woman, a very clever American lawyer who was sort of the overseer of the articles of the World Bank. So it is in some senses modeled on the World Bank. After AIIB, Beijing announced Made in China 2025, which is an industrial-style policy program to try and make sure that China is ahead in 10 of the most important advanced technology sectors like driverless cars, artificial intelligence, and so on. And this also, I would say, frightened Washington because it meant that a lot of Chinese state money was going into those important industries. And then I would say the most revealing thing that Xi Jinping did came in February last year, when he declared himself basically emperor for life and emperor of everything. He had organized in the previous few months for his party colleagues to rewrite the Chinese constitution so that term limits would be done away with, and he would be able legally to stay as leader of China for as long as he wanted. This was a very startling development, and one of my enduring memories of China is calling up a prominent academic who I knew well and who I knew admired Xi Jinping for his policies of projecting China's power around the world. And I called up this professor and I said, so this was like 20 minutes after the announcement. I called him up in Beijing and I said, so what do you think of this? And he was silent. He said, he stuttered basically. He said, I really don't know what to say. I'm really, really taken aback, and hung up politely. It was a very, very telling moment. And I think it shook a lot of people, particularly in academia and particularly in the business community. So now I just want to talk a little bit about what it's like to report in China. And I see my colleague Lucy Hornby from the FT in the back, so she may disagree with everything I'm about to say. But we have just a couple of slides to illustrate this point. So this is Lu Wei, who's a really interesting character. He was like vice president of Xinhua for a number of years. And in 2014, Xi Jinping chose him to become the czar of the internet. And his job was basically to shut off the Chinese internet from the rest of the world. And he's a very, as you can see, he's a kind of charismatic character. And he led the first international internet conference in China, where people from around the world, including the heads of the big tech companies in Silicon Valley, were invited. And basically, his job was to make sure that the Chinese internet was censored and was not infiltrated by bad things from the West. We wrote this story. I wrote this story with Paul Moser, my colleague who knows a lot more about tech than I do. And it appeared on the front page of the New York Times. Lu Wei refused to give us an interview. But a couple of weeks after it appeared on the front page, he called me up and said, "Oh, come and see me." So I said, this is extremely unusual for a Chinese bureaucrat to invite an American reporter into his office. So I went over there, and he was sitting in an armchair per usual. This is how Chinese officials receive you, and there was another armchair for me, and there were some very frightened looking aides taking notes in front of us. And so I started to take notes. He said, "Oh, no, this is not for a story. I just want to, I just want to get to know you. I just want to see that you're all right here in China." So I never did quite figure out what it was all about, but someone said to me he was probably, one, flattered that he was on the front page of the New York Times, but two, scared to death because he'd put his head above the parapet, and his colleagues were loathing him for it. Well, about I don't know, 18 months later, he was dramatically fired from his job. And about a year after that, he was charged with corruption. And then last year, there were very grim photographs of him in a courtroom pleading guilty. Of course, no trial, no public trial, no real charges, pleading guilty to corruption. And he is now behind bars for 14 years. So this is kind of a story of rising high and falling hard in China. The next one is about North Korea. As you know, borders China, and North Korea was very high on the list of stories while I was there. It's been replaced, of course, by the trade talks and by Hong Kong. But I used to go up to the border at Dandong to figure out how the Chinese were breaking the sanctions. And there were some very interesting yarns about how Chinese textile manufacturers in the south would have outposts up in the northeast, and they would send orders into North Korea, where, by the way, the North Koreans had quite advanced German machinery to make clothes of all kinds. And at the end of the month, we met a woman who said that the accountant of one of these firms, talked about putting $100,000, the equivalent of $100,000 in a backpack, and going down to Dandong and paying the factory that they had been contracting to. But what I want to say about this is, all the time that we were in Dandong on our various trips, we were followed by sometimes as many as 6 or 7 cars with, who were they? They didn't look like very experienced secret police. They looked like basically kids who were there to monitor what we were doing. But the point is, it was a dampener on people that you wanted to interview. I mean, the only way that we got to talk to this woman was that Yufan Huang, who worked with me as a researcher, was able to make an appointment with her in a pizzeria in a shopping mall. And I sort of stood a long way away, and I was kind of the bait for the followers, and he snuck into the pizzeria and talked to her. And they were so conscientious, I have to say, that they followed us to the airport And two of them, actually, these were not young kids, these were two Secret Service guys, followed us through there was passport control, or internal passport control, to the gate of the plane to make sure we got on and went back to Beijing. So that I can talk about that in a light way, but wherever we go in China, we are followed. And that is, you can put up with it, it's not a big deal. Sometimes you're called into a police station. That's not such a big deal if they let you go after a couple of hours. But it is it's not a big deal in terms of your security particularly, but it's a big dampener on your reporting, which is of course the point. I mean, legally, under rules that were devised by the Chinese government, I think around the time of the Olympics to show that they were an open society, foreign reporters are allowed to go anywhere. And you can go anywhere. But you often find that when you get to the other end, that there are people waiting for you. In fact, there is one town near the North Korean border where I used to go by train, and they knew I was coming because they tracked me. They knew before I got there, and they're waiting for me at the train station because I'd been there before. They can electronically track you. So the next slide is, I think you'll wonder, why she put something up about Picasso? Well, this was a very interesting, this sort of talks a little bit about the middle class in China, I think. This was a very interesting exhibit that was on this summer in Beijing, straight from the Picasso Museum in Paris. It was in Beijing, and it was a great exhibit of Picasso's art in his youth. And the idea was to show Chinese creativity, basically, and what Picasso was like as an artist. And Picasso was well known in China in the 1950s, early 1950s. His famous dove was on the wall of a big CCCP meeting. So he's not only a great artist, but he was well known, so it attracted huge crowds, including very conscientious children who were taken by their teachers. So this was a Sunday afternoon, and there was a parent hovering in the back of this crowd. So I said to the parent, you know, why are you here? Why did you bring your 9-year-old daughter? And he said, well, she had a really tough exam this morning, Sunday morning. So I thought I'd bring her to the Picasso exhibit so she could learn and play at the same time. So I think this is an interesting example of how parents, like parents here, are really keen for their children to suck up and know what they possibly can, even on a Sunday afternoon. So this is a story about Xinjiang and the Uyghurs. I wrote this just before I left in August, and I tried to make the point that we've reported a lot in the New York Times about the situation in Xinjiang and the incarceration of more than 1 million Uyghurs. And we've reported about how this seems to have been started by Xi Jinping's trip there in 2014. It was his first and last trip to Xinjiang. And soon as he was leaving, there was the report of an attack at a police station in Xinjiang. And the Chinese said that this was a group of Uyghurs attacking the police station. Whether it was or not, I'm not going to say. But it seems to have been the impetus for the start of the crackdown. And soon after, Xi Jinping brought the chief of the Communist Party in Tibet, who'd done a very, in Xi Jinping's eyes, very good job in calming down Tibet. He brought him from Tibet and installed him in Xinjiang, and they very quickly built detention centers and extended the jail system. So there's been very little criticism of this around the world for several reasons. First of all, I think most people would agree, the Trump administration has said very little about it. More to the point, the president has said nothing about it. Pompeo, the Secretary of State, has said from time to time that it's appalling and we should do something about it, but until the President of the United States says something, it doesn't really matter. particularly in this situation when China and relations between China and the United States are basically conducted mano a mano, president to president. Second, the United States withdrew from the Human Rights Council in Geneva. The Human Rights Council is basically the place where such matters as the Uyghurs are discussed. So this has left the floor and all meetings open to Chinese delegations who have taken great advantage of this open space and have organized extremely well and have won huge victories at the Human Rights Council in the sense that there's been no criticism at all. And thirdly, to I think everybody's surprise, and for reasons that are really somewhat unfathomable, the Muslim nations of the world have made no critiques at all and have remained silent, and even to the point where in March earlier this year, the Islamic organization met in Abu Dhabi and actually congratulated China on its treatment of its Muslim minorities. So if the Muslim countries are not going to criticize China, the West is going to be slow. And the last slide I want to show you is this one, which is written by my colleague Chris Buckley, who knows more about Chinese politics than anybody on the planet. He is an amazing reporter. He's lived in China for 20 years, and he's been with the New York Times for the last 6 years. Before that, he was with Reuters. He wrote this story about Xi Jinping's decision to become emperor forever. And if you'll notice, there are the words in the headline, stealth, speed, and guile. This story, and it's all about how Xi Jinping organized to get the party to agree to rewrite the constitution so he could be leader without any term limits. The morning this appeared, I got a call at 8 a.m. from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Calls from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs are not that unusual when they want to complain about something, but 8 a.m. is pretty early. And I was ordered to appear at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs at 11 o'clock. So Chris and I went along, not quite thinking that it was going to be about this, but not quite sure what it was really about. And we got read a 2-page, we got read the Riot Act, put it that way. We had crossed the red line. Such criticism of the leader of China was unacceptable. And we later learned that this word stealth was particularly objected to. Maybe because it pulled back the rug from the idea that this change was done democratically within the party. We were never told why, but we were told that stealth was really bad. So after they finished reading us the Riot Act, Chris and I started to ask some questions. But usually friendly interlocutors from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, except there was one more senior one who we didn't know, just turned on their heels and left. And I've never been able to figure out whether it was because they left so quickly because they were slightly embarrassed that they had to read such a tough statement, or whether they agreed with it, because the Ministry of Foreign Affairs is sort of low in the pecking order, and it's usually the Department of Security that tells them what to do and what to tell us. So whether they were slightly embarrassed that they had to read such a strong statement, or whether they agreed with it, we'll never know. So with that, I'm going to end, and more than happy to take your questions.
You've talked about the limits on foreign reporters. Is this specifically aimed at Americans or Western reporters, or would any foreign reporter likely be treated in much the same way you were?
All foreign reporters are treated, are watched very carefully when they go out of Beijing. I can't account for other reporters, but we do have a foreign correspondence club in Beijing, which the Chinese government refuses to recognize. And members of that club, there's a committee, and members of that club watch very carefully what happens to all kinds of reporters. And there are many, many reports every month of reporters being taken into police stations, being questioned, having film taken, having phones examined, etc.
Okay. You talked about the State Department lunch on Valentine's Day. I thought that was wildly appropriate for what you were describing as the relationship. But can you describe what it is that the American side of this romance really wants out of China? What's the structural change? Just to become more capitalist with communist features, or what are we?
Well, I don't think anybody in Washington or anybody else or anybody in the United States expects China to become a democracy. I think that, I mean, that idea may have existed with the missionaries back in the 1920s and 30s, but that idea is ridiculous. I think in 2012, at the time of that lunch, things had gone pretty well between the United States and China. The United States basically welcomed China into the World Trade Organization. China had benefited from that, and at the same time, American businesses had benefited mightily from the Chinese market. I mean, think about Apple. I mean, Apple was doing gangbusters in China, still is. Qualcomm, GM. I mean, the market, it was a huge market, and everybody wanted to be part of it. And nobody really wanted to call China onto the carpet. Everybody knew that China was taking advantage of the World Trade Organization. Everybody knew that there was kind of theft of intellectual property. But the White House at that time, the administration at that time, had been distracted for, let's say, 10 years by the war in Iraq and the war in Afghanistan. They'd been distracted by 2008, the great financial crisis, which, by the way, China came out of very well. So there was a combination of distraction and things that were going pretty well, and I think people expected more of the same.
One final question from me. China and the old Soviet Union had a very complex relationship. I think that's the polite word to describe it. What is the relationship that the two sides are looking for between Russia and China going forward?
Well, I can't resist but go back to that 1967 movie. We didn't show it, but there was an amazing scene at the embassy of the Soviet Union in Beijing when we were there. It was the gates of the embassy.
The embassy of the Soviet Union, or you mean Russia? Oh no, it's back in the old film. Yeah, right. Sorry.
The Moscow embassy. I mean, there were effigies of, the Russian leaders, and there were bonfires outside, and it was down with the Russians, and amazing scenes. So yes, that's an illustration of the complicated relationship. And Stalin and Mao Zedong really didn't see eye to eye over North Korea for a while, and they nearly went to war over an island in 1969. But these days, Putin and Xi are extremely friendly. I mean, Russia is now hardly a threat to China, quite the opposite. The tables have turned. Back in '67, it was the mighty Soviet Union and the weak China. Now it's the mighty China and the weak Russia. But whatever and Russia can do very well from China. It needs its oil, it needs its energy, it needs all kinds of things. And they can gang up together against the guy in the White House. That's what a lot of it's about.
All right. Let me turn to the audience for some questions. Raise your hand if you'd like to ask Jane a question. Back. Yeah, I see a hand, and I can't see who's associated with the hand.
Did you get saved in '67, and why do you think they allowed you to leave with a film? Was that a problem?
Interesting. Yeah, we always felt extremely safe because they just took us over. When I say they, the China Travel Service, which organized our trip, just took us over, and they were obliged to have Red Guards protect us everywhere. So we were this newfound, what can I say? We were used for propaganda. I mean, you could see us, carrying flags into the commune. We didn't have much choice, but we didn't mind either. I mean, we thought it was pretty interesting. We were learning all the way. So we felt safe. Interestingly, there was another group went the year after us, another Australian group. It was led by Steve Fitzgerald, who later became Australia's first ambassador to Beijing. And they ran into trouble. By that stage, the Cultural Revolution had gone a little sour, and there were many more factions. And a couple of Australian students took pictures of things they shouldn't have taken pictures of. I mean, I don't know, a statue or something. And they were hauled into police stations, and Steve had to use his pretty remarkable Mandarin to get them out of there. So after that, there were no more trips to China. On your question about the film, so this was filmed by a guy called Roger Whittaker, who was one of the students, but he was also a cameraman with the Australian Broadcasting Commission at the time. And he was furious because he had to leave the film behind, and they insisted on processing it. They lived up to their word. They sent it back to him 6 months later, but it was all washed out. I mean, he rescued some of it, but you could see the quality is not great, in part probably because of the processing in Beijing after we left.
You talked about surveillance, physical surveillance, when you were traveling. I'm wondering about digital surveillance and how much of a concern, how much of a damper that is on your work. In the office, at home, having your cell phone, for example. Can you talk about that? Did you have experience?
Sure. I mean, by its very nature, you can't really know. But we at the New York Times, like the FT and other organizations, take precautions with our. Obviously, we have VPNs in the office, in pretty sophisticated VPNs in the office in Beijing, and we have them on our laptops. And our New York office is very vigilant about, and we have a direct cable between Beijing and Hong Kong, which we hope minimizes the interference. But we operate on the assumption that they know everything and have the capability to know everything.
One is, can you talk about the experience of Chinese journalist colleagues? I mean, there was a question about how foreign correspondents were treated. I think Chinese journalists are much, much more vulnerable. Maybe you could speak to that. And then the second question was, do you find that your editors are amenable to all kinds of stories about China, or are they particularly interested in only certain kinds? And have you had any challenges with trying to run or pitch or publish certain kinds of stories?
Well, I'll answer the second question first. I mean, I work for the New York Times. So the New York Times is, I think, a responsible newspaper that's interested in anything and everything. So I can't think of one story that I wanted to write that they wouldn't accept. So as you can see, I mean, I wrote across the board. Speaking for the paper that I know best, I don't think there's any story that I would think as a journalist that was valid that the editors would say no to, and I think that's true for the main outlets that operate in China. As for Chinese journalists, it's actually a very, very, very sad story. I wrote a story earlier this year, which I basically thought of as the last man standing. It was a guy who had been an investigative journalist in Beijing for many years at a state-run outlet, and he finally quit middle of last year, following the path of many, I would say all of the great journalists in China. Basically, there's no more investigative journalism. It's all state-run media with very high degree of censorship. And it's extremely sad that there is very little capacity for independent coverage of the economy. There's some on the economy, but not much, and certainly none in politics, and very little on social questions.
So you said earlier that Xi Jinping, when he took power, made it very clear that he was in direct competition with the United States, and that he wanted to firm up control of the government and of the party. I just want to hear your thoughts on how you see him taking advantage of the current geopolitical situation where the United States is kind of retreating from the global stage, and how he plans to push the envelope and see how far that competition can go.
Well, I know this is a favorite question at the Kennedy School.
Power, power, power. That's what we're all about here.
Well, I think it's a very important question. And I think it's got to start with the situation of the American military in the Asia-Pacific, now more fondly known as Indo-Pacific. And I'm not quite sure what bringing India into the equation adds to the equation, actually. I think that's a sign of the trouble right there. I think that I'm not a military expert, but it's pretty clear that the Chinese are closing the gap. And I think it's pretty clear that they want the United States out of the Pacific Ocean. I think that's their goal. I don't think they care about the rest of the world. And we'll see how long it takes.
And you mean the entire Pacific, not just the Western Pacific?
Well, I mean the Western Pacific to start, and then let's see about the rest of it. I mean, I think one good book to read, if I may, as a counterpoint to the most popular book around here, is something called The China Choice by Hugh White, who is a military strategist, an Australian military strategist who worked with Kim Beazley when he was Defence Minister in Australia. And he makes the argument, basically, that the United States had better make up its mind, and he doesn't say cede, but that's basically what he means. Cede the Western Pacific and keep the rest of the Pacific to itself before there's conflict.
I was wondering if you could comment on how you think regular people in China have perceived and thought about these transitions that you're talking about. I mean, it used to be somewhat easier before the censorship crackdown, but and now even reading through Weibo and stuff like that, it's difficult to see anything but pro-CCP voices. So how do you think that regular people have interpreted these changes in politics in China?
Well, I can't speak for 1.4 billion people. And I don't think censorship is at the top of the list of most people's concerns. I think economic well-being is the top concern. And I think that the party will keep a lot of support, and I think the party is far more resilient than some people in Washington think, because it can keep the support if it can keep the economy going. Now, at the moment, there's economic slowdown. The economy is growing at a slower rate than it has in 30 years. Graduates are finding it hard to find jobs. The auto market is down. And we all know the economy is incredibly indebted. So, but I do think that the Communist Party will do all it can to make sure that that it keeps afloat. And I wouldn't underestimate their ability to do that.
Hi, thank you for sharing. Could you please share your view when you were in China about the Chinese public towards, for example, American media, Western media, foreign correspondents, according to your association with them?
Well, first of all, the question is, what do most Chinese think about the American and foreign media? Well, first of all, most Chinese don't know anything about us because of the censorship. So I don't know how else to answer it. Sorry.
How do you think China is thinking about the protests in Hong Kong, and what do you think is going to happen there?
I think you'd be surprised to know that many Chinese people who know about the protests, and they do know about them now, think that the Hong Kong protests are spoiled children, that they should just smarten up and get on with their lives. And I think the government was very worried about it, and probably still is. but I think Hong Kong has become less important to China. You know, the Hong Kong economy doesn't matter much anymore. You know, the stock market is, you know, about half that of China's. People aren't investing in Hong Kong anymore. And I think China will try and subsume Hong Kong into the Greater Bay Area and make it less relevant economically.
On that same note, I just wonder, to what extent do you think Taiwan's election concerns China?
I have to confess, I'm not a Taiwan follower, but I'm sure it concerns them a lot. But I can't tell you the details. I'm just not a Taiwan person. Sorry.
I started and worked at Beijing for past 8 years, and I work at international NGO, and we all admire the professionalism of New York Times. But the question that even from us, we feel that the stories on New York Times is like quite one-sided. For example, if you open your New York Times app at this time, you will find all these negative stories about China, about the fire war, Hong Kong, Xinjiang, Tibet, but not so much about the ongoing reform, the comprehensive reform of every aspect of Chinese society, from the financial sector to the social governance. Very little information about how the Chinese top leadership want to renovate this whole society and make people, I don't know, whether it make international audience feel quite negative and concerned about China's future development. I don't know what's happening from your perspective, like created such kind of unbalanced.
I mean, I understand where you're coming from, but I just want to remind you that very little news is positive. You know, all news is controversial. That's the nature of news. And the second thing is, I hear what you say about the desire of the government to sort of renovate society. I think that's an interesting way to put it. I think we've done stories along those lines, and I think we've certainly done a lot of positive stories on business developments. You know, on tech, on manufacturing, on climate, and we've done positive stories on climate change. I just have to confess, it's a time when things are very tense between the two countries, and, you know, establishment news media tends to reflect what's going on between the two power centers.
As American politics pulls back from being the counterweight to China, that space opened up. Which actors do you see as becoming really important in that space? Partly potentially through news journalism, through diaspora, through local.
I don't know
civil
what you
society.
mean by American politics, really.
So as Trump is not necessarily criticizing China's ethics around, for example, incarceration of Muslim minorities and those sort of aspects, who do you see moving into that space to provide the counterweight for Chinese actions?
I just think it's hard in this particular point in world politics for countries to step in and fill that void. I mean, I think Angela Merkel tries from time to time, and I think the Germans were very attuned, for example, to the Made in China 2025 program, and alerted, actually, I think, Washington to what this actually meant. So I think the Germans are very knowledgeable about this, although it's interesting to see that it looks as though Germany is going to possibly accept Huawei's 5G network, which would be a big break with the United States. I mean, I don't see anybody stepping in, frankly, and I think that's why, from Xi Jinping's point of view, putting aside Hong Kong and putting aside the dipping economy, things look pretty good for him. Really good.
I was just wondering if you could briefly compare your experience working as a correspondent in Pakistan with your experience working as a correspondent in China.
This is my favorite question. The question is the difference between reporting in Pakistan and in China. So here it is. The Pakistanis are the most garrulous people in the world. They love to talk. So you only need a couple of contacts in the parliament, in the military, in the Taliban, in the business class, and maybe the universities, and you are set. You know what is going on. And they feel, you know, a few inhibitions. You can travel everywhere. I mean, it's quite dangerous. Yeah, it's pretty dangerous. But you can go anywhere. You can go to Peshawar, you can go to Karachi, you can go down to Lahore. I mean, I had a ball. I loved it. I mean, I don't say I love China, but I like China very, very much, and it was the most exciting assignment I've had for many, many obvious reasons. But it's light years apart in terms of reporting.
Yeah, no, I'm just curious about the Uyghurs and why the world has been silent, and whether you've had access, whether your ability to go anywhere includes being able to actually report on why 1 million people have been basically.
So some of my colleagues have been to Xinjiang. I'm not fluent in Chinese and I can't read Chinese, and I think it's really important that if you're going to go to Xinjiang that you be able to see what the noise is around you, because the moment you get off the plane, you are in a box. You cannot go anywhere, do anything. And I think it's so they can judge outside their minders a little bit. They can certainly see the tech surveillance like there is nowhere else in the world. And I think one of my colleagues did manage to get into a home, courtesy of a Communist Party monitor. So one of the most draconian things, actually, of this whole thing in Xinjiang is that the Communist Party sends cadres into the homes of Uyghurs who are not locked up, but Uyghurs who are living at home as families. They get visits 2 or 3 times a month from Communist Party cadres to check up, to make sure that they're not praying, that they are eating pork, that they're becoming Han citizens. And I think one of my colleagues was able to go into one of those settings. But for us to go and speak to Uyghurs outside of Xinjiang and outside of that monitoring is extremely dangerous for the Uyghurs. You cannot do it. If we were caught talking to a Uyghur in Beijing or in Chongqing or somewhere, that Uyghur would be plucked up and taken back to Xinjiang and goodbye. Not a chance.
And why are the Islamic countries not taking?
You'll have to ask them.
You don't have any.
Well, because they're cozying up to China. They want China's money. Pretty easy.
In the back.
So I have a related question about the Uyghurs. What do other Muslim minority communities in China, especially the Hui, think about what's happening in Xinjiang? And is there any changes to the government treatment towards the other
I can't quite hear you. I'm sorry. I understood about the way. What was the other thing?
The Hui, yeah. What do they think about what's happening in Xinjiang? And is there any changes in terms of treatment, the government's treatment towards other Muslim minorities?
There is a more severe monitoring and restrictions on the Hui, and I think they are very fearful that they will be targeted in a more serious way. And in some respects, the Hui is a minority Muslim group that's scattered all around China. And I think for the Hui, the anti-Muslim theme, which by the way the Chinese characterize as anti-terrorist, taking something from the West. I think for the Chinese, the Hui may be more dangerous because they're scattered throughout the country rather than being in one concentrated place where they can just use their hardline tactics and lock everybody up.
It's now 12:59, so I'm going to call a halt here. I want to thank Jane Perlez, and I hope you'll join me in thanking her.